Before we begin the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us where you watched it in the comments. The late summer heat pressed low over the remote frontier valley, turning the riverbanks into a stretch of cracked mud and brittle grass. Elias Ward rode along the edge of the water with slow, steady movements, studying the flow with the quiet attention of a man who had spent most of his life alone. He carried no grand mission. He had come here the same way he did every few days, to check the line of traps he kept near the shallows and to scout the ridge for signs of animal activity before the fall storms arrived. It was a routine that kept his hands busy and his mind from circling back to the winter sickness that had taken his wife and their small son 3 years earlier. Even after all that time, the memory sat in him like an old bruise. He didn't talk about it. He barely allowed himself to think about it. Work and silence were the only things that held him steady. He guided his horse through a narrow cut in the riverbank when he heard something unusual over the rush of the water. A splash, followed by a sharp gasp. Elias pulled on the reins and listened. The river wasn't deep here, but the current could yank a grown man off balance when the rocks turned slick. Another splash sounded, louder this time, mixed with a strained cry for air. Elias kicked his horse forward, slid from the saddle, and scanned the waterline. Downstream, a woman struggled against the current, her arms thrashing as the river pulled her toward a deeper channel. She was fighting hard, but her movements were slowing. Her wet hair clung across her face and shoulders. Her skirt dragged heavily in the water, making her sink instead of float. Elias didn't think. He stepped into the current, bracing his boots against the rocks as the cold water surged past him. His heartbeat hammered in his chest, not from fear of the river, but from the realization that she was seconds from going under. When she slipped beneath the surface, he lunged forward and grabbed her by the arm. Her skin felt cold and slippery, and the force of the current pulled both of them sideways. Elias planted his feet again, gritted his teeth, and hauled her upward until her head broke through the water. "Hold on," he said, his voice low but firm. She didn't answer. Her breath came in hard, broken bursts. He steadied her against him and fought his way toward the bank. Every step felt heavier. The current pushed against his legs. Her body sagged and trembled in his grip. By the time they reached the mud, she collapsed onto her hands, coughing river water onto the ground. Elias knelt beside her, catching his breath. He noticed bruises on her arms, a cut across her shoulder, and a distinct beaded stitching on her clothing, a patchy handiwork. She tried to sit upright, but her legs shook. Elias offered his hand, and after a brief hesitation, she took it. "What's your name?" he asked. "Ahina," she replied softly, her voice rough from swallowing water. She avoided his eyes as she spoke, glancing instead toward the tree line as if expecting someone to emerge from it. Elias studied her carefully. Her breathing was fast and uneven. Fear clung to her movements. She was hurt, tired, and far too alert for someone who had nearly drowned by accident. Something, or someone, had driven her to the river in a panic. He knew enough about the frontier to recognize the signs. People didn't end up in the water like that unless they were running from heat, danger, or memories strong enough to shake their judgment. "I've got a cabin up the ridge," Elias said. "You won't make it far like this. You need rest." Her eyes narrowed slightly, as if weighing the risk of following a stranger. But pain tightened her face when she tried to rise, and she swayed to one side. The decision was made for her by her own body. "Fine," she murmured. "I will go." Elias helped her onto his horse, keeping his movements steady so she wouldn't lose balance. She flinched when he touched her ribs, and he realized the injury was deeper than it looked. As he mounted behind her and guided the horse toward his cabin, he felt her tense posture, rigid, cautious, ready to bolt if needed. Fear shaped every breath she took. Ahina's thoughts flickered quickly as they rode. She had lost her husband only months earlier. Exile had followed soon after. Her own people had turned their backs on her, blaming her for misfortune she had no hand in. She had been moving from camp to camp, trying to avoid the men who believed her presence brought bad luck. When she slipped near the river, her foot had caught on a broken root, and the current had taken her before she could regain her footing. Now she rode behind a man she didn't know, a man with a quiet, unreadable face and a sadness he didn't bother to hide. Elias, meanwhile, felt a stress he hadn't known in a long time. Bringing someone to his cabin was not part of the life he kept. The place had become a shelter where he avoided noise, questions, and reminders of the family he failed to save. But leaving her behind wasn't an option. His conscience refused to allow that. When the cabin finally came into view, a weather-beaten structure tucked beside the slope, Ahina exhaled with a mixture of relief and unease. Elias opened the door and let her step inside. The space was small, clean, and quiet. A single bed stood in the corner. A table with 2 chairs sat near the window. A rifle rested above the hearth. "This will have to do," Elias said. "You can rest here. I'll tend your wounds." Ahina nodded, still uncertain but too exhausted to refuse. As she sat on the edge of the bed, Elias realized the truth he didn't speak out loud. This woman was alone. She had nowhere safe to go. And whether he liked it or not, the old frontier code was already binding their fates together. Here, in a lonely cabin miles from any town, 2 strangers, each carrying grief, fear, and a need for a place to start over, had just stepped into each other's lives. And neither of them yet understood how far that choice would reach. Ahina sat on the edge of the narrow bed, her breath steadying while the quiet inside the cabin settled around her like a weight. Elias set his hat on the table and knelt beside the small chest he kept under the window. He pulled out a tin box filled with cloth strips, a bottle of clear alcohol, and a bundle of dried herbs wrapped in thin leather. When he turned back, he noticed the stiffness in her posture, the way she kept her eyes forward, as if any sudden movement might trigger a memory she didn't want to return to. "Let me see your shoulder," Elias said. His voice remained calm and low, careful not to push. Ahina hesitated, not from distrust, but from the pain. She loosened the ties of her wet dress and let the fabric fall enough for the wound to show. The cut was deeper than he expected, swollen at the edges, a reminder of the rough hands that had shoved her days earlier. Elias cleaned it gently, his touch steady and efficient. She winced once, but didn't pull away. "You'll need to keep it wrapped for a while," he told her. "It's healing but slow." Ahina gave a small nod. She was studying him now, quietly observing how he worked, how he avoided unnecessary words, how he moved with the certainty of someone who had spent years tending injuries without help. He poured hot water into a tin cup and handed it to her. She accepted it with both hands, letting the warmth settle into her fingers. The fire crackled softly. Outside, the sun dipped behind the ridge, throwing long shadows across the valley. Elias placed her torn dress near the hearth to dry and pulled a wool blanket from the trunk, draping it around her shoulders. She tightened it instinctively as a tremor ran through her. "How far were you trying to go?" he asked, not prying, just trying to understand what danger might reach his doorstep. "Far enough to be forgotten," she said quietly. But the river changed that. Her answer carried the truth she didn't expand on. She wasn't running from a place. She was running from people who had decided she no longer belonged. Elias didn't push for more. He had carried his own reasons for silence for years. Pressing hers would do nothing but close the gap they had just begun to cross. He set a pot of beans and chopped meat on the stove. The room filled with the scent of cooking food, and Ahina's stomach tightened with the first real hunger she'd felt in days. When he handed her a plate, she ate slowly, as if unsure she deserved the comfort of a warm meal. Elias noticed, but didn't comment. When the fire settled into a steady glow, the cold began to creep in through the floorboards. Elias reached for his bedroll, intending to sleep on the ground, but Ahina spoke before he could unroll it. "The floor is colder than the river," she said, her voice steady but not confrontational. "And you kept me alive today. I won't have you sleep where the cold bites." Elias paused. "You take the bed. I'll be fine." Ahina shook her head. "No, we share. There is space, and neither of us should freeze." The decision wasn't made out of boldness or expectation. It came from the practical instinct of a survivor who understood what cold could do to an exhausted body. Elias considered objecting, but he saw the firmness in her eyes, the same look he had seen when she fought the river. "All right," he said. They lay at opposite sides of the bed, backs turned, separated by a respectful stretch of blankets. The fire flickered across the walls, casting steady light over the room. The space felt small, but not uncomfortable. Two strangers trying to breathe evenly, trying not to disturb the fragile sense of safety forming between them. Ahina closed her eyes, but sleep didn't come easily. Her shoulder throbbed, and every creak of the cabin made her muscles tense. Still, the warmth of the bed and the quiet presence beside her eased some of the fear that had followed her for weeks. She exhaled slowly, allowing her body to settle deeper into the mattress. Elias stared at the wooden beams above him. He felt the tension in his chest, an old instinct that told him not to let anyone too close. Yet here he was, sharing the one place he had kept untouched since losing his family. It felt strange, unsettling, but not wrong. Ahina had nearly died today. Bringing her here was not a mistake. It was the only thing he could live with. A cold draft slipped under the boards, brushing against his feet. He pulled the blanket tighter, and he felt something shift, not in the room, but in the simple understanding that neither he nor Ahina was entirely alone anymore. The bed creaked softly as she adjusted her position, and her breathing grew steady, calmer than when she first entered the cabin. Elias closed his eyes, letting the quiet settle around them. The cabin, once a place built to keep the world out, now held two wounded souls trying to survive a valley that offered little kindness. Outside, the coyotes began their night calls. Inside, the warmth of shared space pushed back the cold. And without speaking it aloud, both of them understood that tomorrow would bring questions about danger, about trust, about where either of them could go from here. But for now, the only thing that mattered was that the night held them safely. The morning light crept through the narrow cabin window, settling across the wooden floor in a soft, steady glow. Elias opened his eyes to the low crackle of the dying fire. Ahina was already awake, lying still on her side, her breathing quiet but controlled. She shifted slightly when she noticed him stir, careful not to cause pain in her shoulder. Elias rose first. He moved with deliberate quiet, pulling on his boots and stirring the fire back to life. Ahina sat up slowly, testing her weight against the bed frame. She watched him work, trying to understand the habits of the man who had pulled her back from the river. Every movement he made seemed methodical, measured not by fear, but by experience built from years of living alone. "Your shoulder any better?" he asked as he poured water into a tin cup. "It hurts less," she said, but still stiff. Elias nodded. He prepared a small basin of warm water mixed with herbs to reduce swelling. Ahina removed the blanket and allowed him to rewrap the wound. Her eyes followed his hands. His touch was careful but firm, the touch of someone who had tended injuries before. She wondered who he had cared for, though she sensed the answer without needing to ask. When he finished, she pulled the blanket back around herself, grateful for the warmth. Elias stepped outside to check on the horse, giving her a few quiet minutes in the room alone. It allowed her to take in the cabin fully for the first time. Clean tools hung along the wall, a rifle polished and maintained, and small personal objects tucked neatly into corners, suggesting a man who held onto the past quietly rather than trying to erase it. Ahina touched a smooth stone on the windowsill, its surface worn flat by years of handling. It was simple, but the way it had been placed, carefully, respectfully, told her it had belonged to someone important. She let go of it gently. Elias returned with a bucket of fresh water. "You hungry?" he asked. She nodded. He set a pan of cornmeal on the stove and added leftover meat from the night before. As the food cooked, Ahina moved toward the small table, her steps cautious but more stable than the day before. She lowered herself into a chair, observing the room again, trying to place her thoughts in some order. When they sat to eat, Elias spoke first. "Someone hurt you before you reached the river," he said, his tone steady, not probing. "If they're close, I need to know." Ahina lowered her eyes to the bowl in her hands. The question was necessary. She understood that. This was his home, and danger carried consequences for anyone inside it. "They were from my tribe," she finally answered. "Not all of them. Only a few." They believe my husband's death meant I should be cast out. They said misfortune follows me. Elias listened with careful attention. Not pity, just understanding. Life on the frontier often twisted people's beliefs into harsh judgments. Exile was not uncommon, but the weight of it varied from person to person. For Ahina, it was another wound layered over the loss she had already endured. Will they come looking? He asked. No, she said. They think the river took me. Her voice stayed calm, but the words left an ache beneath them. Being forgotten was safer, but it was also final. Elias sensed the mixture of relief and grief in her answer. It explained her hesitation, her guarded silence, and her exhaustion. She wasn't only running from people. She was running from the idea that she no longer belonged anywhere. After breakfast, Elias checked his traps and tools. The chores were routine, and though he usually worked alone, he didn't mind the quiet presence that now moved slowly around the cabin. Ahina folded the blankets neatly, then picked up his torn coat from the chair. She studied the ripped sleeve, ran her fingers along the frayed edge, and reached for a small pouch she kept tied at her waist. Without asking, she began to repair the tear using fine deer, sinew thread, and the steady hand of someone raised to mend clothing from necessity. When Elias returned to the cabin, he paused at the sight. Her concentration was calm, focused. The coat had belonged to him for years, and the tear had been there long enough that he had stopped noticing it. Watching her fix it brought a small, unexpected shift in his chest. You didn't have to do that, he said. I can work, she replied simply, and it helps to keep my hands busy. Elias nodded. He understood the value of work. Activity kept the mind from sinking too deep into old memories. Later in the afternoon, Ahina stepped outside and walked a short distance to breathe the open air. The valley spread wide before her. High ridges, scattered pines, and the river winding through it. She felt the sharp sting of loss, but also the faint pull of something steady, something safe. The cabin, weathered and quiet, no longer felt entirely like a stranger's home. Elias joined her outside, carrying an axe to split firewood. She watched his practice swing, each strike clean and controlled. She found herself reassessing him, not just as the man who saved her, but as someone carrying scars of his own. He didn't speak of them, but they shaped his solitude. Why do you live so far from town? She asked. Less noise, he said, less to remember. The answer was brief, but it revealed more than he intended. Ahina understood that kind of choice. Distance was often the only protection for those who had lost too much. As the sun dipped lower, Elias brought the firewood inside. Ahina followed him quietly, carrying a smaller bundle. They worked in unspoken coordination, the ease between them growing naturally, shaped by simple tasks and shared space. When night settled over the valley, they returned to the same bed as before. The air was colder than the night before, and the fire's warmth barely reached the far side of the cabin. Elias lay still, giving Ahina room. She shifted once, adjusting the blanket to cover more of her legs. Neither spoke, yet the silence between them no longer felt uncertain. It felt like a place where both could breathe without being judged. Ahina closed her eyes, letting the exhaustion of the day sink into her bones. Elias watched the fire fade into embers, feeling a calm he hadn't expected. The woman beside him was still a stranger, but her presence eased a loneliness he had lived with for too long. The valley outside lay quiet. The river moved steadily in the dark, and in a small cabin built for one, two people who had lost nearly everything began to settle into a fragile sense of belonging neither had planned to find. The next morning brought a sharper chill, the kind that hinted at early autumn settling into the valley sooner than expected. Elias woke first, easing out of the bed so he wouldn't disturb Ahina. She slept more heavily than before, her breathing steady, her face less tense. Healing was finally taking hold, though her shoulder still needed rest. Elias stepped outside to bring him more firewood. The air carried a mix of pine, dust, and the faint smell of smoke drifting from somewhere beyond the ridge. He paused, narrowing his eyes at the horizon. Smoke could mean a campfire, ranch hands moving cattle, or something less harmless. The The valley had grown too quiet in recent days, and he trusted the unease in his stomach more than the stillness in the air. Ahina emerged from the cabin doorway as he set the wood down. She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders and scanned the ridge. She caught the faint smoke line as well. "That is not from your traps," she said quietly. "No," Elias agreed. "And it's too black to be brush burning on its own." The observation carried weight. Ahina understood these lands well enough to read danger from a single detail. Elias appreciated that. It meant she was no stranger to survival, even when she'd been pushed to the edge of it. She joined him by the workbench as he checked the rifle he kept near the door. He wasn't preparing for a fight, just ensuring it was ready. The valley rarely stayed peaceful for long. "Men passed near my old camp 2 nights before the river," Ahina said, offering information she had held back until now. "They were not from my tribe. They moved with horses too thin and tempers too quick. They wanted food, shelter, anything to take." Elias listened closely. This detail mattered. Strangers moving through the valley without direction often meant trouble. Hungry drifters, desperate men, sometimes worse. His jaw tightened as he considered the possibility that the smoke on the ridge came from the same group. "You think they followed you?" Elias asked. "No," she said firmly. "They did not care who I was. They cared only about what they could steal." Her voice remained calm, but Elias detected the faint tremor beneath her words. She had already been chased by fear. She didn't need the valley to bring more of it. He set the rifle down. "I'll ride out later. See what's moving near the ridge." Ahina looked at him, realizing the risk. "Not alone," she said. "If something happens, there is no one to bring you back." Elias considered her words. It had been years since anyone had spoken of his safety with genuine concern. The feeling sat uneasily in his chest, but not in a way that pushed her away. "You stay here," he said. "Your shoulder's not ready for riding." Ahina lowered her gaze, accepting the truth in his words, even though her instincts urged her to stand with him. She watched him saddle his horse, noticing how he checked every strap and buckle. Careful preparation from a man who'd lived too long expecting the worst. Before he mounted, he paused at the doorway where she stood. "I'll be back by sundown." Ahina nodded once. "I will keep the fire lit." Elias rode toward the ridge, following the path through scattered aspens. The valley stretched out behind him, quiet and deceptively calm. His mind ran through possibilities: lost travelers, a mining group, or a small band of raiders testing new ground. Whatever the answer, he needed certainty. Ahina stayed near the window, watching the horse disappear over the rise. Her shoulder throbbed, reminding her she was not ready to defend herself if trouble reached the cabin. She tightened the blanket around her and moved to the table where Elias's spare rifle lay. She picked it up, weighing the cold metal in her hands. She had used weapons before, though never with the steady practice of a frontiersman. Still, she checked the chamber and set the gun where she could reach it. As the hours passed, she cleaned the small cabin, folded blankets, and trimmed herbs Elias kept hanging by the window. She needed movement. Stillness allowed fear too much room. Every sound outside caught her attention: a shifting branch, the distant knock of a woodpecker, the wind dragging through the grass. She tried to read each sound carefully, just as her grandmother once taught her, but the valley carried new voices she didn't yet understand. Late in the afternoon, Elias returned. His horse moved quickly, but not in panic, which eased her breath. When he stepped inside, the look on his face told her he had found something, but not something immediate enough to demand haste. "Tracks," he said. 3 riders. Not local. They passed through the ridge heading north. Ahina's hands tightened on the edge of the table. "They carried long guns?" she asked. "Yes," Elias answered. "Old ones. Poorly kept." That matched the group she had seen. The tension in her shoulders eased, not because they were gone, but because she finally had confirmation. Uncertainty did more damage than truth. "They're not close anymore," Elias continued. "But the valley's been too quiet. Could be more groups moving through." Danger was not immediate, but it was near enough to take seriously. The cabin, though sturdy, was not meant for prolonged defense. Ahina looked at the rifle on the table. "Teach me." she said. If trouble comes, I should know how to stand beside you. Elias studied her expression. There was no pride in her request, no attempt to prove strength. It came from simple necessity and a desire not to be helpless again. He respected that. It kicks harder than you expect, he warned. Then I will learn to hold it steady, she replied. They stepped outside into the cool evening air. Elias showed her how to balance her stance, how to rest the rifle against her shoulder without aggravating the wound, and how to breathe before pulling the trigger. Ahina followed every instruction with quiet determination. Her first shot rang out sharply, echoing through the valley. She flinched slightly, adjusting to the recoil, then realigned her aim with steady, controlled movements. Good, Elias said. Again, she fired another round, stronger this time, her hands more confident. She exhaled slowly, a flicker of pride flashing in her eyes, subtle, controlled, but real. As the sun sank behind the ridge, painting the grass in cold gold light, Elias set the rifle back on the table inside. The training had built a thin thread of reassurance between them, something reliable in a valley where safety changed from day to day. Ahina sat near the fire, her shoulder aching but her spirit steadier than that morning. Elias watched her quietly, noting how she carried herself with strength even when her body fought her. She wasn't fragile. She was exhausted, wounded, and wary, but stronger than most people who stepped into this valley alone. The night settled around the cabin, but neither felt the same uncertainty that had filled their first evenings together. There was danger in the valley, yes, but they were no longer facing it as strangers sharing a room out of necessity. The bond between them had begun to take shape in the way they moved, worked, and prepared side by side, silent but undeniable. Night settled fully over the valley, colder than the evenings before. The fire inside the cabin glowed bright, but the warmth reached only so far. Ahina sat near the hearth with the blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders, her freshly trained hands still tingling from the weight of the rifle. Elias stepped inside after checking the perimeter once more. The lines of concern still faint across his face, but no longer sharp with immediate fear. He hung his coat by the door and glanced toward her. You did well today, he said. Ahina lifted her eyes. I learned what I needed. There was no pride in her tone, just quiet resolve. Elias understood that feeling. People who had survived loss rarely celebrated the skills they gained afterward. They simply used them because life demanded it. He moved toward the stove, placing another piece of wood inside. As the fire rose, its glow illuminated the small space between them. Ahina watched him with a calm attention that had developed over their days together. She had already pieced together fragments about him, his steady habits, his silence, the weariness that showed in the set of his shoulders when he believed no one was looking. But she still didn't understand why he trembled slightly after long hours outside, or why certain sounds, like the wind shifting sharply, made his breath hitch for a moment. You were out there a long time today, Ahina said gently. Elias paused, knowing what she was asking without her saying it outright. He wiped his hands on a cloth and sat across from her. The ridge brings back things I try not to remember, he said. Storms, sickness, the winter that took my family. I rode that trail the night they got sick. Couldn't get the doctor here fast enough. Ahina's eyes softened. She didn't offer comfort in words. She knew better than to smother grief with phrases. Instead, she shifted slightly closer, letting her presence answer his honesty. It was enough. A gust of wind struck the cabin wall, and Elias looked toward the window. His instincts sharpened for a moment, but the sound faded into the trees. Ahina didn't miss his reaction. You are afraid of being alone with those memories, she said quietly. Maybe, Elias admitted, but I'm more concerned about someone sneaking up on this place than anything in my head. Ahina absorbed his words slowly. She had wondered why he kept watch so often, even when the valley seemed peaceful. His caution came not from paranoia, but from a life spent witnessing how quickly things could turn. She stood, careful not to strain her shoulder, and added more wood to the fire. You kept watch last night, she said. Tonight, I can stay awake for a while. Elias shook his head. You're still recovering. Get your rest. Ahina met his eyes steadily. Rest does not come easily when the mind is full, she said. Keeping watch will quiet mine. Elias considered arguing, but he saw the truth in her expression. She needed something to keep her thoughts steady just as much as he did. He nodded, allowing her to take the first watch. She wrapped the blanket tighter and sat at the window with the rifle resting across her knees. Elias lay on the bed but kept his eyes open for several minutes, listening to the soft creaks of the cabin and the steady rhythm of her breathing. When he finally drifted into sleep, it was the first time in a long while that he allowed someone else to guard the dark around him. Hours passed in silence. Ahina stayed alert, studying the faint outline of the trees and the empty yard. The night air carried no threat, only the distant call of an owl and the whisper of wind brushing through the brush. Her grip on the rifle loosened slightly as her mind settled into a calm she had not felt in weeks. When Elias woke before dawn, he found her sitting exactly where he left her, her gaze fixed on the window. "You should rest now," he said. Ahina nodded, her body finally showing the weight of exhaustion. As she moved toward the bed, she paused beside him. "You saved me at the river," she said softly. "Tonight, I kept danger from reaching you." Elias didn't respond immediately. The exchange was simple, but its meaning ran deep. Two people balancing the weight of survival in a place where neither could afford to stand alone. Ahina settled into the bed and closed her eyes. Elias kept watch until the first light of dawn touched the ridge. When he stepped outside, he surveyed the valley with practiced caution. The tracks he'd found yesterday had faded in the wind, and no new ones marked the ground. But he didn't let his guard drop. The valley never stayed quiet without reason. Later in the morning, he returned to find Ahina awake. She moved more confidently now, her steps firmer, her eyes clearer. She reached for a pot, intending to prepare food, but Elias stopped her gently. "Take it slow," he said. "Your shoulder won't forgive you if you push too hard." Ahina allowed him to help her settle at the table. She studied him as he cooked, his steady hands, his controlled breathing, the hints of worry he tried to hide. He wasn't protecting her out of duty alone. Something deeper had begun to shift in him, something he didn't yet know how to acknowledge. "You fear I'll be gone if I step outside again," she said quietly. Elias didn't deny it. "You've had too many reasons to run," he replied. "And I've had too many people leave." Ahina looked toward the door. "I'm not running anymore. Not from danger, not from myself." Those words eased something inside Elias, something tight, something long neglected. The cabin no longer felt like a shelter for one. It felt like a place where two people were learning how to trust the ground beneath their feet again. The day passed with calm chores and steady silence. Ahina helped where she could, sorting herbs and stitching small tears in Elias's gear. Elias repaired a broken hinge on the door and checked the traps near the creek. They moved with the ease of people who were no longer strangers. When evening came, they shared the bed again, lying at opposite sides, but not as distant as before. The fear that had shaped their early nights had softened into something steadier, something rooted in the understanding that both had been living alone for too long. Outside, the valley rested under a clear sky. Inside, two people who had stepped into each other's lives by chance were beginning to rely on the quiet strength they found there. The next morning arrived with a sharper wind rolling down from the ridge, carrying a heaviness that made Elias stop halfway through chopping firewood. Something in the air felt off, not dangerous yet, but unsettled. He straightened his back and listened carefully. The valley was quiet, too quiet for a day that should have been alive with bird calls and small animal movement. Ahina stepped out of the cabin, fastening the blanket around her shoulders. She noticed his stillness immediately. "What do you hear?" she asked. "Nothing," Elias replied. "And that's the problem." She followed his gaze toward the north ridge. The faint smoke they had seen earlier was gone, but the absence didn't ease the tension. Ahina sensed the same wrongness, the quiet that usually meant men were nearby, watching or waiting. Elias set the axe aside. "We'll take a look," he said. "Not far, just enough to know what's moving." Ahina nodded. Her shoulders still hurt, but she refused to stay behind without reason. She tightened her belt, tested her range of motion, and retrieved the rifle. Elias considered stopping her, but saw the determination in her eyes. Leaving her alone would have been more dangerous than taking her with him. They rode along the riverbank, following a narrow trail through brush and tall grass. For a while, there was no sign of movement. No horses, no footprints, no campfires. But as they reached a bend near a cluster of rocks, Ahina pointed to the ground. "Here," she said. Elias dismounted and crouched beside her. The dirt held a set of hoof prints, deep and erratic, as if the horse had been pushed too hard. Another set of lighter tracks crossed them, barefoot, smaller than a man's but not a child's. Elias ran his fingertips over the prints. The pattern told a clear story. Someone had passed through in a hurry, maybe injured, maybe fleeing. "These tracks are fresh," he said. "Less than a day." Ahina scanned the ridge with sharp, steady eyes. "They are not riding together," she added. The rider chased the one on foot. Elias rose slowly. A chase this close to the cabin meant danger was not drifting somewhere far off. It was moving through their valley. He couldn't ignore that. People didn't flee across open land unless something dangerous pushed them. They followed the tracks carefully, stopping whenever a branch snapped or the wind shifted. After a short climb up a stony incline, they spotted the remnants of a small camp. A broken fire pit, scattered ashes, a torn piece of fabric caught on a thorn bush. Elias lifted the cloth. It was stained with dry blood. Ahina's expression hardened. "Someone was wounded," she said. And in a hurry, Elias surveyed the area again. No bodies, no signs of where the injured person went. But a second set of horse tracks told him that one of the riders had left this place recently. "Whoever was here didn't stay long," he said. "Either they escaped, or they were taken." Ahina's jaw tightened. The possibility of men who took instead of asked, men who hunted instead of searched, was something she knew too well. It tightened the space inside her chest in a way that felt painfully familiar. "Those riders," she said, "they came from the same direction as the ones who passed my camp." Elias didn't dismiss the connection. Men desperate enough to raid and chase could easily drift farther into the valley, searching for shelter, food, or prey. "We need to head back," he said. "If someone is hiding or someone is hunting, the cabin is too exposed." They mounted again and turned toward home, keeping a steady but cautious pace. Every sound, branches shifting, birds lifting off, even the river hitting rocks, made Elias's senses tighten. Ahina rode close behind him, her eyes scanning the brush with practiced focus. Her movements had changed. She no longer carried only fear. Now she carried readiness. When the cabin came into view, Elias exhaled a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. They dismounted and entered quickly. Ahina checked the windows while Elias loaded both rifles and set them within easy reach. She turned to him. "If those men return, they will come from the north," she said. "The ridge gives them cover. They will watch first, then move." Elias nodded. He had thought the same. He moved the table aside, clearing space near the door. Ahina positioned the second rifle where the light wouldn't catch the metal and give it away. After the preparations settled, the tension remained. The valley had grown smaller unexpectedly, closing in on them. Neither wanted to admit it aloud, but danger had drawn close enough that their shared days of calm could no longer continue untouched. They sat near the fire, not to relax, but to think. The flames cast steady light across their faces. Elias finally broke the silence. "That person on foot," he said. "If they're alive, they're scared. And if they're scared, they may try to reach the river or any shelter they can find." Ahina lifted her eyes. "They might come here." Elias nodded. "Or those chasing them might." Ahina considered this deeply. The cabin had become a safe place for her, a place where her heartbeat could slow for the first time in weeks. The thought of danger reaching it filled her with a protective instinct she didn't expect. "What will we do?" she asked. Elias looked at her with steady focus. "We'll keep watch. Together." She accepted the plan with a firm nod. Outside, the wind scraped against the cabin walls, and the trees rustled with restless motion. The valley felt alive with warning. As evening settled, Elias and Ahina stood outside for a final look across the land. The sky had turned a deep shade of blue, the first stars blinking into view. The world looked calm, but both understood how deceptive that calm could be. Ahina rested her hand near the rifle slung across her shoulder. Elias felt a faint shift in the way she stood beside him, not just as someone he was protecting, but as someone prepared to protect him in return. They returned inside, bolting the door against the night. The cabin, once a quiet refuge, now carried the weight of approaching danger. But it also held something steadier. Two people whose trust had grown strong enough to stand against whatever pressed in from the ridge. The valley outside darkened fully, hiding the movements of whoever was still out there. The danger was no longer distant. It was already on its way. The night passed with long stretches of silence, broken only by the wind and the occasional pop from the fire. Elias remained awake through most of it, his senses sharpened by the uncertainty pressing in from the ridge. Ahina slept in fragments, light, restless moments drifting between alertness and exhaustion. Each time she opened her eyes, she found Elias sitting near the window, rifle across his lap, watching the darkness with unwavering focus. By dawn, the valley felt colder than the days before. A thin layer of frost covered the grass outside, and Elias stepped onto the porch to study the land in the early gray light. Ahina joined him a moment later, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. Her voice came quiet but certain. Something moved near the ridge last night. Elias nodded. I heard it. Stayed far, but not too far. It wasn't his imagination. He had caught the faint rhythm of hooves and the distant crack of branches. Someone had circled the valley, keeping their distance but not retreating. Ahina tightened the blanket. Whoever chased, that wounded person hasn't left. Elias didn't disagree. He scanned the frost-covered clearing with slow, careful movements, making sure nothing had been disturbed. Everything looked untouched, but the land held silence in a way that suggested it was waiting. After a sparse breakfast, they went outside to complete the tasks they couldn't ignore, checking the horse, securing the tools, and ensuring the cabin's doors and windows were reinforced. Ahina moved with more ease, though her shoulders still ached when she lifted her arm too high. As they prepared for the day, Ahina paused near the river path. If that injured person is alive, she said, they will be hiding. They will be cold. They may not last much longer. Elias knew she was right. He also knew the risk of searching in a valley with raiders nearby. But he couldn't leave someone wounded to die in the brush, not when the tracks had led so close. Well, look, he said, not far, not long. Ahina didn't question his decision. She simply followed. They moved carefully along the river, keeping low and listening for movement. After walking for nearly an hour, they found a sign, a small smear of dried blood on a rock, and beside it, a broken piece of leather that looked like the strap of a satchel or water pouch. Ahina crouched beside the rock. This is from the person on foot, she said. They stopped here. Rested, maybe. Elias studied the nearby brush. A few bent branches revealed the direction the wounded person had taken, downstream, toward a narrow cluster of trees that would provide better cover. They followed the signs until a faint sound reached them. A low, strained breath. A body shifting against the ground. Elias raised his hand for Ahina to stay low as they approached the thicket. Inside, half hidden beneath branches, lay a young man, thin, pale, and barely conscious. His leg was wrapped in a torn shirt soaked with dry blood. Dirt and sweat clung to his face. When he saw Elias and Ahina step closer, he flinched and tried to lift a small knife with trembling fingers. Easy, Elias said, lowering his rifle. We're not here to hurt you. The young man's breath hitched. He lowered the knife, but his eyes stayed wide with fear. They're still looking, he whispered. 3 of them, maybe more. I ran until I couldn't. Ahina knelt beside him, moving the branches aside. She checked the makeshift bandage. The wound had dried, but not healed. Infection had begun to set in. You cannot stay out here, she said. You will not last another night. The man's gaze moved between them, uncertain whether he could trust strangers in a valley this isolated. But fear of the men hunting him outweighed everything else. I saw them last at the ridge, he said. They were searching. They want what I escaped with. Elias's attention sharpened. What did you take? The young man swallowed. A map. Gold workings. They're not miners. They're thieves. They want to raid a claim in the mountains. I was supposed to show them where, but I ran. The explanation made sense of the chaos they found earlier. Tracks, a broken camp, signs of chase. These men were not drifters. They had purpose, and greed made them dangerous. Ahina placed her hand gently on the young man's arm. You come with us. He shook his head weakly. You'll be in danger. We already are, Elias said. They helped him stand, supporting his weight between them. The walk back to the cabin was slow, each step careful. More than once, the young man leaned heavily against Elias, nearly collapsing. Ahina watched the tree line constantly, alert for any sign of movement. When they reached the cabin, Elias eased the young man onto the bed and began tending the wound. Ahina heated water, crushed herbs, and handed Elias what he needed without being asked, moving with instinct and focus gained from years of caring for others in her tribe. The young man grimaced as Elias cleaned the wound. He grabbed the blanket with trembling fingers. What do I call you? Elias asked. Thomas, he whispered. Thomas Hale. Ahina repeated the name quietly, anchoring it in her mind. This wasn't a stranger now. This was someone depending on them. Elias finished bandaging the leg. You'll stay here until you can walk again. Thomas looked at them with a mixture of relief and fear. They won't stop. They'll find me. They'll find all of us. Ahina spoke before Elias could respond. Then we faced them together. Her voice held no bravado, just certainty. Elias felt something shift inside him at her words. This cabin had been built for solitude, for quiet. But now it held 3 lives linked by circumstance and danger. He glanced toward the window, where the ridge stretched across the valley like a silent warning. The threat was no longer a distant worry. It was heading straight for them, and this time they would not face it alone. The cabin felt smaller with Thomas Hale inside, his injured leg stretched across the bed and his breath catching each time the pain flared. Elias kept the lamp low, while Ahina prepared a mixture of boiled herbs to ease the fever building beneath Thomas's skin. The young man swallowed the bitter liquid without complaint, though his eyes flickered with unease at every sound outside. Elias studied him carefully. How long since you last slept? He asked. Thomas wiped sweat from his forehead. 2 days, maybe 3. Hard to tell when you're running. Ahina dipped a cloth in cool water and pressed it gently to his face. Thomas flinched at first, then relaxed. Thank you, he whispered. She nodded once, not asking for more. She understood the exhaustion of someone who had been hunted. She carried her own memories of that fear. Elias moved to the table, spreading out the small bundle Thomas had carried with him. Inside was a folded map drawn on stiff parchment, marked with crude symbols and jagged lines. Ahina approached and studied it alongside him. This shows more than a mine, she said. These ridges, these marks, they're pathways. Thomas swallowed hard. A group of prospectors opened a new shaft last winter. Rich ground. The men chasing me want to take it. Kill whoever stands in their way. They forced me to guide them, but I slipped away when they weren't watching. Elias frowned. How many are there? 3 at first, Thomas said, but they were planning to meet others farther north. Elias felt tension tighten across his back. 3 had tracked Thomas into the valley. 3 more could join them. And the map they wanted, now lying on Elias's table, was the key to their plan. Ahina folded the map. They will come here, she said. You said they won't stop. Thomas nodded weakly. They follow tracks better than they follow orders. Once they find where I fell, they'll find the prince. Then the cabin. Elias paced the room, weighing options. He could abandon the cabin, lead the group away, or try to hide Thomas elsewhere. But any of those choices carried risk. Not just to Thomas, but to Ahina. Elias steadied himself. No one's leaving here tonight, he said firmly. You're both safer inside until we know where they are. Ahina glanced toward the rifle leaning near the window. She remembered the lessons Elias had given her. She was no longer helpless, and she didn't intend to face danger as a shadow in the corner. Thomas shifted anxiously. "You shouldn't risk yourselves for me." Elias stepped beside him. "You came to this valley already hurt. That makes you my responsibility now." Thomas blinked at the unexpected firmness. Ahina saw something shift in him, a recognition of safety he didn't know he had found. The sun dipped behind the ridge, leaving the valley in a muted blue haze. Elias lit a second lamp, then quickly covered its front with a tin panel so its glow wouldn't spill outside. He moved with the quiet efficiency of a man preparing for a long night. Ahina tended the fire, keeping it low but warm. She felt a familiar ache in her shoulder, but she ignored it. Her focus stayed on the land outside the window, the darkening tree line, and the possibility of men approaching unseen. After a moment, she turned to Elias. "If the raiders come from the ridge, they'll have high ground. They could watch us without us seeing them." Elias nodded. "There's an old irrigation ditch behind the cabin. Runs low enough to give us cover if we need it. You and Thomas will use it." Ahina's eyes narrowed slightly. "You expect to face them alone?" "I expect to position myself where they can't corner us," Elias replied. But Ahina felt the truth beneath his words. He was thinking of protecting them, even if it meant putting himself at risk. She stepped closer, her voice steady. "We stand together. If we separate, we lose more than ground." Elias held her gaze. Her determination stayed unshaken, even in the face of danger drawing near. He let out a slow breath, not in frustration, but in acknowledgement. "Fine," he said, "but stay low and stay close." Ahina nodded. As night deepened, the first sign of movement reached them, a distant echo of hooves striking stone. Faint, but unmistakable. Elias extinguished the lamp immediately. The cabin fell into darkness except for the weak glow of the fire. Thomas tensed. "They found the trail," he whispered. Elias moved to the door, listening, every muscle sharpened with purpose. Ahina stood beside the window, peering into the valley. Her breathing stayed calm, controlled. Elias glanced at her briefly, her posture steady, her hands firm around the rifle, and felt a quiet surge of trust he hadn't expected to form so quickly. Minutes passed with the sound of hooves fading, then returning, then fading again as if the riders were circling the valley, testing its edges. Elias counted the rhythms. Only 2 horses. That meant one rider had gone elsewhere, or one of them had abandoned his horse. Neither possibility comforted him. Hours stretched. Thomas drifted in and out of sleep, jolting awake whenever the sounds grew louder. Near midnight, the valley finally stilled again. Elias and Ahina exchanged a look, no words needed. They both felt the same thing. The raiders hadn't left. They were waiting. Ahina lowered her rifle slightly. "They're studying us," she said quietly. "Watching our lights, our movements." Elias nodded. "They want to be sure he's here before they move." The cold pressed harder against the cabin walls. Elias added a piece of wood to the fire, then stepped back beside Ahina. For a moment, their shoulders almost touched. The silence between them held a steady, grounding weight, something that made the threat outside feel smaller, even as it neared. Whatever danger approached, it would find the 2 of them standing side by side. And with dawn coming soon, the raiders' patience would not last much longer. Dawn crept over the ridge in a pale, muted band of light that barely touched the frost-coated grass. Elias stood at the window long before the sun rose fully, watching the valley with a rigid stillness. The raiders had circled through the night, testing distance and angles, but never committing. Their behavior said everything. They were waiting for daylight to strike. Ahina joined him, fastening her coat and checking the rifle sling over her shoulder. Her expression was calm, but her eyes carried a sharp, focused alertness. She had slept very little, but the exhaustion made her more deliberate, not reckless. Thomas shifted uneasily on the bed, wincing as pain flared through his injured leg. "If they come," he whispered, "don't let them take the map. They'll burn the mine and kill anyone they find working it." "They won't get it," Elias said, "and they won't get you." He didn't bother saying more. Thomas's fear wasn't cowardice. He had been hunted, beaten, and left half dead. His warnings were not guesses, they were memories. Elias checked the cartridges, slid 2 rifles into easy reach, and moved toward the door. Ahina followed closely, her posture steady. Before stepping outside, Elias turned to Thomas. "If anything happens," he said, "use the ditch behind the cabin. Stay low. Don't run unless I tell you." Thomas nodded, swallowing hard. He pulled himself upright with his hands, ready to move despite the pain. The cold outside hit with sharp clarity. Elias scanned the ridge again, eyes narrowing. A faint blur of movement caught his attention. 2 riders crouched behind a fallen tree, barely visible beneath the scattered shadow of pines. They thought they were hidden well enough, but Elias had spent years reading the land, and their presence pulled tight against the natural pattern of the valley. "They're waiting for the third," Elias murmured. Ahina followed his gaze. She didn't need him to point. "He is on foot," she said quietly. "He will come closer than the horses." Elias nodded. She had noticed the same thing he had, the way the brush near the river had snapped in the night, the way the birds hadn't returned to the low branches. Someone was moving closer, alone and silent. They stepped back inside and waited. Minutes passed in heavy quiet. Elias listened with the same intensity he once used when guarding his family's home years ago. Every shift of wind, every scrape of wood, every breath inside the cabin mattered. Ahina waited beside the window, tense but ready. Then it happened. A faint creak of floorboards near the back wall. Someone testing the frame. Someone close enough to feel the warmth leaking through the cracks. Ahina moved first, raising her rifle in a smooth, controlled motion. Elias stepped to the side of the door, positioning himself out of direct line of sight. Thomas covered his mouth, his breath trembling. The door latch clicked, slow, cautious, deliberate. Elias didn't hesitate. He yanked the door open, pulling the intruder off balance. A man stumbled inside, knife raised, surprise flashing across his face. He was lean, unshaven, and desperate, his clothes torn from days of tracking through brush. The knife arced toward Elias's chest. Ahina fired. The shot slammed through the air, echoing across the valley. The intruder jerked backward, the knife slipping from his fingers as he collapsed onto the cabin floor. Elias exhaled sharply, not from fear, but from the sudden shift in danger. Ahina lowered the rifle, her hands steady despite the adrenaline surging through her. Her expression didn't show triumph, only resolve. She had acted to protect them, nothing more. Outside, the horses snorted nervously. The 2 raiders on the ridge had heard the shot. "They're coming," Elias said. "Now." He grabbed the second rifle and stepped out the door as Ahina followed. The raiders rode hard down the ridge, not stealthy anymore, not patient. They had lost their advantage and knew it. The lead rider fired a wild shot that cracked into the dirt near the cabin. Elias fired back, striking the ground in front of the horses, forcing them to break direction. One rider veered left. The other continued straight toward the door. Ahina steadied her rifle, tracking the second rider with controlled breath. Instead of shooting the man, she fired near the horse's front hooves, sending it stumbling sideways. The rider flew off, crashing into the dirt with a heavy grunt. Elias sprinted toward him, tackling him before he could rise. The man fought back with frantic strength, swinging his fist and reaching for sidearm. Elias pinned his wrist with the heel of his hand, twisting until the gun dropped. The man screamed, but the sound held no power. Ahina rushed to Elias's side and kicked the fallen gun away. The rider tried to reach for a knife, but she stepped on his wrist, stopping him cold. The second raider circled wide, trying to flee toward the ridge. Elias raised his rifle, but Ahina grabbed his arm, not to stop him, but to steady his aim. Elias fired, striking the ground near the fleeing rider's horse. The animal reared and bolted, throwing the rider off and sending him rolling down the slope. He scrambled to his feet and fled into the brush without looking back. Elias could have pursued, but he didn't need to. The man was disarmed, terrified, and alone. He wouldn't return. The rider pinned under Elias's Nee finally stopped fighting. Fear replaced his aggression as he stared up at Elias and Ahina, breath coming in sharp bursts. "You can go," Elias said, "but you don't step into this valley again." The man scrambled to his feet and ran without hesitation. Ahina exhaled, her shoulders lowering as the tension drained from her body. Elias looked at her, still steadying his breath. "You saved my life," he said quietly. Ahina met his gaze. "You saved mine first." They returned to the cabin, where Thomas stared wide-eyed at the open door, the corpse, and the quiet aftermath. "It's over," Elias said. "They won't come back." Thomas let out a long, shaking breath. Relief washed over his face. Relief deeper than survival alone. For the first time since entering the valley, he felt protected. Ahina set the rifle down. Elias closed the door. The danger that had pressed in from the ridge had finally been confronted, and the cabin, shaken, scarred, but still standing, felt different now. It had become more than shelter. It had become evidence that trust formed in silence could hold firm even under the weight of fear. The cabin settled into a deep hush after the fight, the kind of quiet that comes only when danger has fully passed. Elias dragged the body of the fallen raider outside and covered it with a tarp until morning, when he could bury it far from the cabin. Ahina tended to Thomas's bandage again, replacing the soaked cloth with fresh herbs to keep the infection from flaring. His fever had eased, and for the first time since he'd arrived, his breathing sounded steady rather than desperate. When Elias stepped back inside, the tension that had gripped the room for days had softened. The immediate danger had been driven off, and the valley outside lay still. No sounds of hooves, no voices carried by the wind, no shadows moving along the ridge. Thomas swallowed hard as Elias approached. "I didn't think I'd live long enough to see them run," he said. "You will," Elias replied. "And when your leg heals, you'll ride to the nearest town and hand that map to someone who can protect the claim. Those men won't trouble you again." Thomas looked down at his hands. "I thought the world had given up on people like me." Ahina answered gently. "The world does not choose who is worth saving. People do." Thomas nodded, emotion tightening his throat. Elias rested a hand on the table. "You'll stay here until you can walk on your own. After that, you choose where you go next." The young man absorbed the words with quiet relief. As the morning light strengthened, Elias and Ahina stepped outside together. The frost had melted into glistening patches of water across the grass. Smoke rose faintly from the cabin's chimney. The valley looked clean and calm, like the land itself was letting out a breath. Ahina watched Elias as he prepared a small shovel to dig a grave for the raider. She noticed the heaviness in his shoulders, but it wasn't fear or fatigue this time. It was contemplation, recognition of how quickly people could be forced to fight for what little they had left. "Let me help," she said. Elias shook his head gently. "I'll take care of it. You've done enough." She didn't argue. Instead, she walked to the riverbank, rinsed her hands in the cold water, and let the current drift around her fingers. The river that had nearly taken her life now felt like a boundary she had crossed into a new existence, one shaped not by exile, but by choice. When Elias finished the burial and returned, Ahina was sitting on a flat rock near the water. She looked up at him, the morning light soft on her face. "You were ready to face those men alone," she said. "And so were you," he replied. A quiet understanding passed between them, one built from long nights of shared watch, whispered conversations in firelight, and the unspoken promise that neither would abandon the other in danger. They walked back toward the cabin side by side. Inside, Thomas slept more peacefully than he had in days. Elias cleaned the rifles and stored them properly. Ahina folded blankets, swept away the dirt tracked in during the struggle, and placed a pot on the stove to make a warm meal. Their movements felt natural, coordinated, like two people who had been working together for far longer than the short time they had known each other. As the afternoon sun rose high, Elias stepped outside again to repair a loose board on the cabin wall. Ahina joined him, holding nails and handing them to him one by one. Their hands brushed occasionally, and each time, neither pulled away quickly as before. Ahina glanced toward the distant ridge. When Thomas leaves, she said quietly, what will you do? Elias hammered another nail, then paused. Keep living here. Keep to the land. But it's quieter than I'd like now. She understood what he didn't say. The solitude that once protected him had grown too heavy. The cabin had changed during their days together, not because of the danger, but because it no longer held only grief. She spoke cautiously, but with honesty. I don't wish to return to the past I came from. There is nothing there for me. Elias lowered the hammer and met her gaze. So what do you want? Ahina took a slow breath. A place where I'm not hunted. A place where I'm not alone. A place where I can stay if someone wants me here. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of her exile, her loss, her will to survive. She didn't ask for promises or declarations, only clarity. Elias stepped closer, his voice steady. You have a place here, not because of what happened, not because of danger, but because I want you to stay. Ahina's breath caught, soft, almost imperceptible, yet full of relief. The sun dipped lower, warming the front of the cabin. Thomas slept. The valley rested. And inside the quiet that spread between them, Elias gently took Ahina's hand. Her fingers tightened around his, not in desperation, but in affirmation. There was no uncertainty left now. Days later, when Thomas's strength returned enough for him to ride, they prepared a small pack for him and gave him Elias's extra horse. He rode out of the valley with gratitude in his eyes and promises to send word from the town. As he disappeared over the ridge, the cabin felt still, not empty, but renewed. Elias and Ahina stood together on the porch, watching the horizon settle into the glow of early evening. The danger had passed. The fear had loosened. What remained was a quiet future they both chose willingly. Ahina rested her head lightly against Elias's shoulder. He didn't move away. The silence between them no longer held sorrow. It held the steady warmth of two lives intertwined by circumstance, strengthened by trust, and sustained by the simple act of staying. The valley stretched wide and peaceful, and for the first time in a long time, Elias felt the land wasn't something he survived. It was something he shared. And Ahina, once exiled and alone, finally found a home where she was safe, wanted, and able to begin again. The story closed not with a question, but with a choice, two people deciding to live their days together, with nothing left chasing them but the wind moving gently through the grass.